The first official record of humanity inside the wider galaxy was not a battle report or a warning, but a footnote buried deep in a trade archive, a simple note stating that a minor species from a yellow star system had begun limited expansion beyond its home orbit and had requested observer status with several regional powers. And that quiet, patient request set the tone for everything that followed, because humans waited while their message went unanswered. They waited while alien bureaucrats argued over whether a species that still used chemical rockets deserved even a response, and they waited while merchant guilds quietly tested human borders with illegal mining ships and surveyed drones that scraped resources from asteroids humans considered their own. And during all that waiting, the humans did not protest loudly or threaten retaliation. They documented every violation, logged every encounter, and adapted, a process overseen by people like Daniel Carter, a mid-level officer in Earth's Unified Defense Directorate, who spent his days reviewing sensor data that showed foreign vessels drifting just close enough to test reactions, and by Laura Bennett, a civilian trade envoy who sat through endless failed calls with alien intermediaries who smiled politely while offering nothing. And from the alien perspective, this patience looked like weakness, something the Korthi Empire in particular believed wholeheartedly, as its ruling council reviewed human data projections and concluded that a species unwilling to assert itself aggressively would never do so, a belief voiced openly by high strategist Velrek, who remarked that humans appear biologically inclined toward delay and compromise, and would make ideal subjects or buffers once the Empire expanded into their sector. And so the pressure increased slowly and deliberately as Korthi patrols began to reroute shipping lanes through human space without permission, escorting Imperial convoys directly past Earth's outer colonies while broadcasting legal notices written in Korthi script that no human court recognized. And again, humanity waited. Not because it lacked the means to respond, but because it was still learning, still measuring the Empire's habits, command structures, response times, and political fault lines. A process coordinated quietly by analysts like Henry Lawson, who noticed patterns in Korthi fleet rotations and realized that what looked like overwhelming force was in fact a rigid system, unable to adapt quickly. And while alien observers laughed at human restraint and mocked their diplomats for asking for talks that never came, Earth invested its time into infrastructure buried deep beneath planetary crusts, into fleets that were never paraded or announced, into training doctrines that emphasize endurance, redundancy, and the willingness to absorb losses without emotional reaction, something humans had learned long before they ever left their planet. And when the first true test came, it did not arrive as a grand invasion, but as an imperial decree delivered without ceremony, transmitted to every human relay station at once, stating that the Korthi Empire now claimed administrative authority over all systems within a specified radius that included Earth and its colonies, offering humans a chance to retain limited self-governance under imperial supervision if they complied within one standard cycle, a message that caused outrage among civilians but was met with calm in military planning rooms where officers like Daniel Carter simply nodded and marked the date, because this was a moment they had been waiting for, the point at which patience stopped being observation and became leverage. And while alien commanders assumed humans would either submit or lash out prematurely, Earth did neither, instead sending a brief acknowledgement that the message had been received and that a response would be delivered in due time, a phrase that Velrek dismissed as further proof of hesitation, unaware that across human space dormant systems were activating, supply chains shifting, and crews being quietly reassigned, all without dramatic announcements or threats. And as the deadline approached, the Korthi Empire grew impatient, interpreting silence as fear, and authorized limited enforcement actions, seizing a human outpost on the fringe and detaining its personnel with minimal resistance because the local garrison had orders not to escalate, an image that spread quickly through imperial channels as evidence that humans would fold, reinforcing the belief that patience was weakness, a belief that would soon cost the Empire everything. Though at that moment no alien watching the feeds of compliant human settlers being marched into holding facilities could imagine that this calm acceptance was not surrender, but the final confirmation humanity needed to move from waiting to action. When news of the seized outpost reached Earth, the public reaction was carefully managed, official statements expressing concern and restraint, while privately the event was treated as a controlled experiment that had finally yielded usable data, because the outpost had been chosen for location, its limited strategic value, and the presence of monitoring systems hidden far beyond what the Korthi occupiers could detect. And as the detained personnel were transported deeper into Imperial space, their captors never realized that every jump, every delay, every command authorization was being mapped in real time by human intelligence teams who now understood not just where the Empire moved, but how it thought under conditions it believed were safe. And people like Laura Bennett were quietly recalled from diplomatic roles and reassigned to analysis cells where political language was stripped away and replaced with probability models that showed the Korthi Empire depended heavily on reputation and fear rather than flexibility, a structure that punished hesitation in others but could not tolerate in itself. And this insight shaped the next phase of human response, which remained invisible to the wider galaxy because it involved no fleets crossing borders and no declarations of war, only subtle economic shifts as human-controlled trade nodes quietly stopped honoring Korthi currency conversions, forcing Imperial merchants to reroute through neutral intermediaries who suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by demand. And at the same time, long-range probes that had spent years drifting unnoticed were activated, repositioning themselves around key Imperial shipyards and data relays, not to attack but to listen, to build a picture so detailed that human planners could predict with disturbing accuracy which admirals would argue against escalation and which would push for force. And this knowledge was centralized under a small strategic council led by people like Margaret Collins, an older civilian coordinator whose calm demeanor masked decades of experience managing crises, where waiting had saved millions of lives. And she understood better than most that patience was not passive but active, a continuous choice to delay action until its effect would be absolute. And while the Korthi Empire grew more confident, issuing new decrees and tightening its grip on seized territories, it also began to fracture internally as border governors complained about resource strain, and fleet commanders requested reinforcements that never arrived because the Imperial Corps assumed no real resistance existed, a dangerous assumption reinforced by the continued lack of human retaliation. And then just before the compliance deadline expired, humanity finally responded, not with threats but with a detailed legal transmission addressed to every major power in the region, outlining decades of documented violations, illegal seizures, and treaty abuses committed by the Korthi Empire against multiple minor species, including evidence gathered quietly through trade, observation, and shared intelligence, material so thorough and unemotional that even long-standing rivals of humanity paused to review it seriously. And this move confused Imperial leadership because it did not fit their expectations of either submission or rebellion. It was instead an exposure, one that forced other galactic actors to reconsider their own relationships with the Empire. And while Velrek dismissed the transmission publicly as irrelevant human rhetoric, privately emergency sessions were convened as neutral systems began delaying support and demanding clarification, delays that compounded logistical issues already growing worse. And throughout all of this, humanity still did not fire a shot, still did not mobilize openly, allowing the Empire to dig itself deeper into overextension and political isolation, unaware that the quiet, relentless patience it had mocked was tightening like a vice around the very structure that had once made it dominant. By the time the compliance deadline passed without incident, the Korthi Empire found itself in an unfamiliar position where nothing dramatic happened, yet everything felt unstable. Because no surrender came and no uprising erupted, only a slow tightening of conditions that Imperial planners struggled to explain. And as weeks turned into months, the cost of occupying human fringe systems quietly increased due to supply inefficiencies, labor resistance that never crossed into open rebellion, and constant administrative delays caused by regulations humans followed so precisely that they became obstacles, a form of resistance that frustrated commanders like Overseer Jarnak, who reported that human civilians complied with every order while finding ways to render each one ineffective. And this pattern extended beyond occupied zones into the wider empire as human trade networks continue to shift, forcing Korthi fleets to escort convoys across longer routes while fuel reserves dwindled. And during this period, Daniel Carter was reassigned from data review to operational planning, where he worked alongside naval tacticians who had spent years refining doctrines built around delayed engagement, doctrines that assumed the enemy would underestimate the threat until it was too late to adapt. And the first sign that patience was about to end came not from human space, but from an internal Korthi incident when a frontier battle group was forced to stand down after its resupply contracts. collapsed overnight due to neutral brokers citing new risk assessments based on human disclosures. A small event that cascaded as other fleets demanded assurances that never came. And Velrec responded by pushing for a limited punitive strike against a human colony to reassert dominance, a move opposed by several admirals who warned that resources were already stretched thin. But imperial culture rewarded decisiveness over caution, and so the strike was approved under the assumption that humans would finally react emotionally and expose their weakness. And when the Korthi task force arrived at the colony, they encountered minimal resistance as expected, orbital defenses powered down, evacuation corridors opened, and human commanders transmitted calm requests for time to relocate civilians, a response that reinforced alien confidence and led them to deploy ground units prematurely, never noticing that the defensive silence masked a complex web of sensors and autonomous systems recording every movement. And as the occupation began, the humans did something unexpected. They left behind infrastructure that appeared abandoned but continued to function just enough to support Imperial forces, systems designed to fail slowly and predictably, draining power, corrupting logistics data, and feeding subtly altered information back to Korthi Command, a strategy devised by engineers like Samuel Price who believed that the most effective sabotage was the kind an enemy trusted, and over time, these small distortions accumulated until the occupying force was operating on assumptions that no longer match reality, a vulnerability that human fleets positioned far outside detection range were waiting to exploit. And as weeks passed without a dramatic human counterattack, Velrec declared the operation a success and prepared to escalate further, unaware that each day of apparent calm was a deliberate gift of time humanity was using to align political will, finalize contingency plans, and allow the Empire's own rigidity to lock its forces into predictable patterns. And when the moment finally approached, it did so without warning, not through a declaration of war or a public broadcast, but through a sequence of precise actions executed across multiple systems at once. Actions that would transform human patience from a misunderstood trait into the defining weapon that would dismantle an empire that had mistaken silence for submission. The first wave of human action was so quiet that many Korthi commanders did not realize it was happening until reports stopped making sense, because across Imperial space navigation beacons began returning slightly altered timing signals that caused fleet movements to drift out of synchronization, a change small enough to be dismissed as calibration error, but widespread enough to slow response times everywhere at once. And as technicians scrambled to diagnose the issue, they unknowingly followed repair protocols that humans had studied for years, protocols that led them to reinforce the very vulnerabilities being exploited. And at the same time, human cyber units activated long-dormant access points embedded not through brute force hacking, but through trade software updates and maintenance routines the Empire itself had authorized long ago, allowing humans to observe command discussions in real time without interfering. And it was during one of these sessions that Daniel Carter listened. As Velrec confidently assured the Council that human resistance was collapsing under pressure, a claim made just hours before the second phase began, when dozens of occupied human systems simultaneously initiated civilian evacuation drills that complied perfectly with Imperial law while overwhelming Korthi administrative capacity, flooding channels with requests, confirmations, and appeals that clogged decision loops and forced commanders to delegate authority downward to officers unprepared for independent judgment. And this mattered because human fleets were already moving not in mass formations but in dispersed elements that blended with commercial traffic until the last possible moment, guided by predictive models that anticipated where Imperial forces would hesitate. And when the first shots were finally fired, they were not aimed at capital ships or population centers, but at logistics nodes, fuel depots, and data relays whose loss would not be immediately visible, but would cripple sustained operations. And reports from these strikes were delayed or misrouted due to the earlier disruptions, meaning that by the time the Empire understood it was under coordinated attack, multiple fleets were already stranded without resupply, and Overseer Jarnak, still struggling to manage the occupied colony, found his forces unable to receive updated orders as power systems failed in ways that appeared accidental, leaving his units isolated and increasingly dependent on local, human infrastructure that quietly shut down in stages, forcing surrender without a decisive battle. And as these events unfolded, Velrec demanded a full-scale mobilization, only to discover that the Empire's reserve fleets could not assemble on schedule because their staging points were experiencing unexplained shortages and traffic conflicts. each one traceable to decisions made weeks earlier under the assumption that humans would never strike back. And throughout the chaos, humanity broadcast a single message to all parties, not a boast or a threat, but a calm statement that Earth was initiating enforcement of its own territorial laws and would cease operations once all illegal occupations ended. A message delivered with precise timestamps and clear conditions, leaving no room for misinterpretation. And this clarity stood in stark contrast to confusion inside the Empire, where commanders argued over authority and responsibility, while their forces lost cohesion. And as neutral powers observed the unfolding collapse, they began to distance themselves from the core of the Empire, closing ports and denying aid, not out of fear of humanity, but out of recognition that the Empire's power had been built on assumptions that no longer held. And by the time Velrek understood that human patience had been a long preparation rather than indecision, the strategic balance had already shifted irreversibly, setting the stage for a final reckoning that would strip the Empire of its influence and leave the galaxy to reconsider what patience truly meant when wielded by a species that had learned to wait until every move mattered. The collapse accelerated after that failed counteroffensive, because the illusion of imperial inevitability was broken, and once broken it could not be repaired. And across the core of the Empire, regional governors began prioritizing their own survival over loyalty to the core, delaying troop movements, hoarding supplies, and opening quiet channels to human intermediaries to clarify terms for withdrawal. And humanity responded to each inquiry with the same measured consistency. No threats, no promises of revenge, only clear conditions that occupations must end, detainees must be returned, and borders must be respected. A simplicity that contrasted sharply with decades of imperial coercion and made compliance feel less like surrender and more like relief. And Daniel Carter observed this phase from a forward command station, where incoming reports showed entire systems reverting to local control without a single shot fired, imperial banners lowered not by force, but by consensus among exhausted administrators who no longer believed the Empire could protect them. And within the imperial capital, Velrek fought a losing battle against reality, insisting that discipline could still be restored if decisive action was taken. But every decisive option required resources and unity that no longer existed. And when a senior admiral openly refused an order citing insufficient logistics and legal ambiguity, the refusal spread, not as mutiny, but as procedural hesitation officers, requesting clarification, revisions, and confirmations until action stalled completely, a mirror of the same patient obstruction humans had practiced for years. And on the occupied human colony, Overseer Jarnak finally negotiated a full withdrawal after his forces lost power to their last reliable supply grid, a withdrawal conducted under human observation with strict timelines that were met to the minute. And as Imperial ships departed, they left behind intact infrastructure and unharmed civilians, a condition humanity enforced not out of mercy, but to demonstrate control. And news of this orderly exit echoed across the galaxy, undermining centuries of imperial propaganda that claimed only the Korthi could guarantee stability. And neutral powers responded swiftly by revising treaties, suspending military cooperation, and recognizing human jurisdiction over contested regions, not because humanity demanded it, but because the Empire could no longer object effectively. And as the final pieces fell into place, a formal session of the Imperial Council was convened where Velrek attempted one last address, warning that conceding to humans would invite chaos. But his words rang hollow in a chamber where patience had run out, and when the vote was called, it was not to escalate the war, but to dissolve the very authorities that had enabled it, transferring power back to regional assemblies in an attempt to salvage what remained. And in that moment, the Korthi Empire effectively ended, not with an explosion or a final battle, but with quiet acknowledgement that it had misjudged a species that understood how to wait, how to endure, and how to act only when the outcome was already decided. A lesson the galaxy would remember long after the Empire itself faded into history. In the months that followed the dissolution of imperial authority, the galaxy entered a period of uneasy recalibration as systems once bound by fear adjusted to the absence of a single dominating power. And throughout this transition, humanity remained deliberately restrained, avoiding rapid expansion or triumphal displays, while focusing instead on stabilization, humanitarian access, and transparent enforcement of clearly defined borders, a posture that confused observers who expected conquest to follow victory, But for people like Laura Bennett, this phase was as critical as any battle, because it would determine whether the galaxy saw humans as liberators, opportunists, or simply another empire in waiting. And so human fleets limited their movements to escort missions and anti-piracy patrols requested by local governments, never arriving uninvited, never staying longer than agreed. And this consistency built trust where fear once ruled, and former imperial administrators began sharing records voluntarily, exposing long-hidden abuses, and confirming that human patience had not only anticipated collapse, but had been designed to survive it without chaos. And Daniel Carter, now promoted into a strategic advisory role, reviewed after-action analyses that showed how close the Empire had come to salvaging its power in earlier years, if only it had understood the nature of the opponent it faced. Yet those same reports also confirmed that such understanding had never truly been possible, because the Empire had been structurally incapable of valuing patience as strength. And as academic institutions across the galaxy studied the conflict, they noted that humanity's decisive advantage had not been superior firepower or numbers, but time management, the ability to delay gratification, absorb short-term losses, and align political, economic, and military action toward a single moment of irreversible leverage, a capability that unsettled older powers who now wonder how many other quiet preparations humans might be undertaking beyond their sight, and in response some attempted to probe human limits with subtle pressure or demands, only to find the same calm acknowledgement and deliberate slowness that had undone the Empire, a reminder that nothing had changed in human behavior except the context in which it was now interpreted. And within Earth itself the war was rarely celebrated. Memorials honoring those detained and displaced emphasized endurance rather than victory, teaching future generations that waiting was not passive but purposeful. And as the first Interstellar Summit convened without imperial oversight, representatives from dozens of species listened as human delegates spoke plainly about mutual restraint, shared law, and the dangers of assuming silence meant consent, words delivered without accusation but with the weight of recent history behind them. And while not all powers agreed, none dismissed the message outright, because the memory of an empire that had underestimated human patience and paid for it with its existence remained vivid, shaping every negotiation and strategic calculation. And as the galaxy slowly stabilized under a more distributed balance of power, it became clear that humanity had not simply won a conflict, but had redefined the terms by which power itself was measured, proving that the most dangerous moment was not when humans fought back, but when they chose to wait and let inevitability do the work for them. Years later, the consequences of that lesson continued to unfold in subtle but irreversible ways, because the collapse of the courtly empire had not created a vacuum so much as it had removed a ceiling that had long suppressed alternative forms of governance. And as regional alliances formed and dissolved in cautious experimentation, humanity remained a constant reference point, not as a ruler, but as a standard by which restraint and credibility were measured. And Daniel Carter, now nearing the end of his active service, often reflected on how little of the war had involved dramatic heroics, compared to how much had depended on collective discipline, on millions of people choosing not to react impulsively when provoked, a cultural trait that analysts across the galaxy struggled to replicate, because it was rooted not in doctrine, but in lived history. And this difference became clear during several minor conflicts that flared among former imperial territories when local leaders attempted to assert dominance quickly, only to find themselves isolated as neighbors refused to support reckless escalation, a behavioral shift directly traced the memory of what had happened when impatience met preparation. And humanity's role in these disputes remained deliberately limited, offering mediation, logistics, or observation only when requested, never positioning itself as an enforcer unless clear agreements were violated. And this predictability reduced fear even as it increased respect, because other species learned that humans did not seek advantage through chaos. And Laura Bennett, representing Earth at multiple summits, noticed that negotiations with humans increasingly focused not on what they wanted but on how long they were willing to wait, a question that carried implicit warning without sounding like one. And in one notable exchange, a rival delegate remarked that human silence now carried more weight than most empires' threats, a statement that spread quietly through diplomatic circles and altered how deadlines and ultimatums were framed. And beneath these political shifts, human institutions continued refining the same principles that had ended the empire, investing in resilience, redundancy, and long-horizon planning rather than rapid expansion, an approach that frustrated factions within humanity itself who argued for a more assertive posture. But those voices were consistently outvoted by leaders who understood that the true advantage lay in never, forcing the galaxy to unite against them. And as new generations grew up hearing the story of the war not as a tale of conquest, but as a study in timing, the cultural memory of patience deepened rather than faded, ensuring that even as technology advanced and borders shifted, the fundamental lesson endured, that the greatest power humanity wielded was not the ability to destroy an empire quickly, but the discipline to wait long enough that when action finally came, the empire destroyed itself, trying to ignore them. By the time the conflict passed fully into history, it was no longer remembered as a war defined by battles or commanders, but as a turning point in how the galaxy understood consequence, because the fall of the courtly empire became a case study taught across academies and councils under many names, none of them flattering, and all of them centered on the same failure to recognize that patience could be a strategic weapon rather than a flaw. And as humanity settled into its place among the stars, it did so without monuments of victory or declarations of supremacy, choosing instead to codify the lessons learned into transparent frameworks that govern trade, defense, and conflict resolution, frameworks that were deliberately slow, layered with review and delay not to stall justice, but to prevent rash action. And Daniel Carter attended his final briefing before retirement, where analysts presented projections showing that no single power was likely to dominate the galaxy again so long as those systems endured, a conclusion that brought him a quiet satisfaction, because it meant the suffering that had been endured without retaliation had achieved its purpose. And Laura Bennett, reflecting years later in a private address, summarized the human position simply by stating that restraint was not kindness and patience was not mercy. They were choices made to ensure that when action was unavoidable, it would be decisive and final. And those words circulated widely, becoming a reference point whenever tensions rose and species considered testing boundaries. And often those tests never came because memory intervened, the shared understanding that humanity had once absorbed pressure, humiliation, and loss without response until moment resistance could no longer be stopped or reversed, and that awareness reshaped behavior more effectively than fleets ever could. And in this way, the end of the empire did not mark the beginning of human dominance, but the establishment of a new equilibrium where power was measured by credibility and endurance rather than fear. And as the galaxy continued its slow, uncertain progress, one truth remained unchallenged, that the greatest mistake any civilization could make was to assume that silence meant surrender, because once before the stars had watched an empire dismiss a patient species, and by the time that patience ran out, there had been nothing left to save.